Ladies and gentlemen, good evening to you all. Thank you all for being here. Am I in your way? Can you see the screen all right? Right. I'm here tonight to tell a story that I think is not as well known as it might be. It's a tale that begins as the 20th century begins and ends just 37 years later. A tale of huge ambition and enterprise, of triumphant success and spectacular failure. Above all, it's a tale that celebrates a whole lost technology and a whole lost way of travelling the world. Zeppelin, Concorde, or dinosaur, or both, because like both, Zeppelins are extinct. They have disappeared from the world and we will not see their like again. The few airships flying today are very much smaller than the great Zeppelins of the 1920s and 30s, and they're used for specialized purposes like aerial survey and advertising. New projects are coming along, matching 21st century know-how with Count Zeppelin's 19th century concept. And these might extend airships' capabilities into new fields. They might look more like spaceships than airships, but they're still likely to have workaday roles, however useful and valuable. Nobody expects to see airships in the glamorous role of carrying passengers across the great oceans like the Zeppelins of 90 years ago. Zeppelins are extinct. Our scientists can date the extinction of the dinosaurs to within 1,000,000 years or so, but we can date the extinction of the Zeppelins to the exact place and the exact time, the day, the hour, the very minute that it happened. It is 7:20 in the evening of Thursday, the 6th of May, 1937, and we are in the state of New Jersey, about 60 miles south of New York City. Lakehurst is a Navy town, even though it's some miles inland. Its Navy base has for many years been the East Coast home of the US Navy's military airship fleet. And now it doubles up as the American end of the transatlantic Zeppelin passenger service. Like those of Britain, France, and Italy, the American airships have suffered a series of appalling crashes with major loss of life. But the German Zeppelins have carried civilian passengers for nearly 30 years without a single fatal accident. German airships rule the sky for long distance travel, and none more so than Hindenburg. It works. Since her maiden flight a year ago, she's made 17 return crossings over the Atlantic Ocean, carrying 3,500 passengers. Her record for the crossing was set in August 1936, a flight from Lakehurst to Frankfurt, her German base, in the near miraculous time for those days of 43 hours and 2 minutes. 2.5 days is more typical, especially flying west into the prevailing winds, but travelling by sea takes more than twice as long. Hindenburg is fast and she is fashionable. If you've got the money, and $450 for a single ticket is a lot of money in 1936, then Hindenburg sells herself exactly as Concorde will 40 years later. Your money buys you temporary membership of an exclusive elite club. Not for you, a week on the wild ocean with 1,000 other folk. You'll travel twice as fast, hardly noticing the weather, with an attentive staff and only 49 other passengers. All as well heeled as yourself, no doubt. Hindenburg is, by any standards, enormous. She's 803 feet long and 135 feet in diameter. You could put 4 Concords end to end inside her, including the wings. She is, and perhaps always will be, the biggest flying object ever built. And here we see, to the same scale, a Boeing 747, the Titanic, and Hindenburg. A Titanic weighed about 52,000 tons, and a fully laden jumbo jet weighs 390 tons. But Hindenburg turns the scales at a dainty 242 tons. It almost beggars belief that something so vast could weigh so little. Hindenburg is now nearing Lakehurst at the end of her first transatlantic crossing of 1937. It hasn't been an easy crossing. Strong headwinds have held the airship back all the way from Frankfurt, and it's over 70 hours since she took off. But at last, she's making her approach. She's 180 feet back above the ground, her 4 big Daimler-Benz engines throttled back as she drifts slowly upwind towards Lakehurst's mooring mast. A little reverse power is sufficient to bring her vast bulk to a halt, floating serenely in mid-air above the waiting ground crew. 2 heavy landing lines are dropped to be caught by men on the ground, and once secured, she will valve hydrogen to reduce lift, and that will bring her gently down to the ground. And then her passengers can disembark, and the passengers for the return flight, many of them members of fashionable American society, bound for the coronation of King George VI in London next week. They can board and leave for Europe. But that moment does not come. People on the ground, and there are hundreds of them, see something alarming. Back near Hindenburg's tail fins, and at the top of her enormous hull, a small flame is burning. So, what exactly is an airship? Well, an airship is a powered, steerable flying machine that uses a lighter-than-air gas, such as hydrogen or helium, to carry it aloft. Airships were built in several countries, including Britain, during the first 4 decades of the 20th century. But it was in Germany that the concept was perfected, and that was largely due to the enthusiasm, commitment, and determination of one remarkable man. This man, Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, was 62 years old when the first craft bearing his name flew in 1900. But as a young army officer in the 1860s, he'd seen manned hydrogen balloons being used for military reconnaissance, and he'd been fascinated by lighter-than-air flight ever since. Now, it's worth taking a moment to consider your options if you want to get airborne in 1900. You could go up in a hydrogen balloon, and you'd probably come down in one piece, but you'd be where the wind had chosen to carry you. You could fit one of those newfangled internal combustion engines in your balloon, like Alberto Santos Dumont. This was still basically a balloon, but it did fly, as you see there, and he won a lot of money for managing that. If you were feeling especially daring, you could strap on a pair of wings and jump off the side of a hill, like Otto Lilienthal, who sadly had died doing just that 4 years earlier. What you could not do in 1900, of course, was to get in an aeroplane. Wilbur and Orville Wright were experimenting with flying models in their bicycle workshop in Ohio, but manned heavier-than-air flight was still a dream and widely regarded as unrealistic. In Britain, Lord Kelvin, the president of the Royal Society, no less, had said as late as 1895, "I can state flatly that heavier than air flying machines are impossible." Even Wilbur Wright, when asked in 1901 how he and Orville were getting on, replied, "Man will not fly for 50 years. Well, perhaps he was just trying to discourage the opposition. Or maybe he was surprised as everyone else 2 years later when the Wright Flyer actually flew. So for Count Zeppelin to achieve powered, controlled flight 3 years before the Wright brothers was no mean feat. The Count's baby was 420 feet long by 38 feet in diameter. And he called her simply Luftschiff Zeppelin 1, or Zeppelin Airship 1. With the Count at the controls, she flew for the first time on the 2nd of July, 1900. An 18-minute flight covering 3.5 miles from Friedrichshafen on Lake Constance, down near the border with Switzerland. As a flying machine, LZ-1 left a lot to be desired, and she made only 3 flights. But Count Zeppelin had got the basic principles right first time. Over the next few years, he built a series of several more airships with increasing success. And here's a quiz question for you. What was the world's first airline? Not upstarts like British Airways or Virgin, obviously. Not BOAC, which was founded in the 1940s, and not Imperial Airways or Pan American, both of which date from the 1920s. Not even KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, the world's oldest surviving airline, which was founded in 1919. No, the world's first airline was DELAG, the Deutsche Luftschifffahrtsaktiengesellschaft, the German airship travel company. It was founded by Count Zeppelin in 1909. It was a revolutionary concept at the time, but DELAG carried a total of 34,000 people on 1,500 flights in the 5 years to the start of the First World War. This is LZ-7, one of the world's first airliners, with a passenger cabin beneath her hull and its carpeted, mahogany-panelled, mother-of-pearl inlaid interior. The gent in the wing collar, by the way, is Heinrich Kubis, and he was the world's first flight attendant. Now, all this didn't go unnoticed abroad, of course. Several other countries, notably Britain, France, Italy, and the USA, were trying to develop their own airship expertise. From as early as 1908, the British government wanted to emulate the success of Count Zeppelin's enterprise in Germany, and His Majesty's Airship 1 was completed by the Vickers Company at Howden in the East Riding in 1911. I don't know which joker decided to call her Mayfly, because the sad fact is she didn't fly. Fixtures weighing 3 tons were taken off her, and still she would not become airborne. And then, while being manoeuvred out of her hangar for further tests, she was caught by a strong gust of wind and her back was broken. Not a very auspicious start. But 2 years later, it was decided to try again, and Vickers began work on HMA 9. Construction was well advanced when the First World War broke out in August 1914. But in March 1915, Winston Churchill, then the First Lord of the Admiralty, cancelled the order. The reason for that was that Churchill was gung-ho for the campaign against the Turks in Gallipoli, which he believed would bring the war to a swift end. When Gallipoli turned out to be anything but a victory, let alone a swift and easy one, Churchill resigned and the order for HMA 9 was reinstated. So HMA 9 flew in November 1916, the first time a British rigid airship had actually taken to the air. Although she couldn't compete with the contemporary Zeppelins, she was at least a viable airship and a successful prototype. Well, the Great War saw military Zeppelins used extensively by the Germans for reconnaissance, and they were also used to bomb targets around England and even into Scotland. On the 26th of September 1916, this Zeppelin, LZ-22, carried out an air raid on Sheffield, and one of the bombs fell on houses in the Cossey Street area of Attercliffe. And the plaque in the wall of this factory tells us that 9 men, 10 women, and 10 children were killed in the raid. And this is the grave of one of the victims, and it says, in loving memory of William, the beloved husband of Elizabeth Guest, who was killed in a Zeppelin raid September 26, 1916, aged 32 years. By the end of hostilities in November 1918, the British had 7 military airships actually in service. Several more were under construction. They were a mixed bunch. 2 were destroyed while actually in their hangar, the same hangar as it happened, in the Vickers Airship Base at Howden near Goole. R-27 was in the hangar in August 1918 when some petrol was spilled in one of the engine cars and not mopped up. When an unsuspecting technician came along later to test the wireless equipment, the inevitable happened. A spark, petrol fumes, an explosion. 1 man died in the fire. But remarkably, the hangar itself survived the fire. It would have been better if it had burned to the ground, really, because 3 months later, airship R-31 was put into the hangar for repairs. And the damaged hangar roof leaked, and R-31's frame, which was not metal but spruce plywood, deteriorated so much that she had to be scrapped. Never buy a used airship from this man. He was in charge of disposing of the ruined R-31, and he sold her for £200 to Mr. Joseph Parker, a coal merchant from Goole, who chopped up the wooden frame and sold it for firewood. He was not a happy man when the customers started complaining that the wood wouldn't burn, which is excellent in an airship, but not very good for kindling. Somehow it hadn't been mentioned to him that the wood had been treated with a fireproofing chemical. On the good side, R-34 flew non-stop from Norfolk to Long Island, New York, the first ever east-west flight across the Atlantic Ocean. She arrived after 108 hours with virtually no fuel left, and because the landing party on the ground had no experience of handling such a large airship, one of R-34's officers, Major Pritchard, parachuted to the ground to direct them, and he thus became the first person ever to arrive in the USA from Europe by air. The R-34 made it back to England safely, completing the first ever return air crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. She was a good ship, but 2 years later, she had to be scrapped after hitting high ground over the North Yorkshire moors. Much worse soon followed. R-38, the biggest airship yet built, broke up and exploded in flight over Hull and crashed in the Humber estuary, killing her commander, Major Pritchard, and all but 5 of the 48 men on board. In 1920, all the RAF airships were formally registered as civilian craft. The RAF, newly formed, had decided that they did not need airships. R-36, still being built by Beardmore's near Glasgow, was redesigned with 50 sleeping berths. This was daring stuff for a country that had no experience at all of running civilian airship services. And crucially, Britain had no Count Zeppelin. We had no driving force prepared to back the project with his own money and enthusiasm. In Britain, all the impetus was coming from the politicians. And you can sense the irritation in London that over in Germany, the defeated enemy, Delag, was back in business. This is LZ-20, Bodensee, the first post-war Zeppelin and the first to have the more aerodynamic teardrop shape that all future airships would have. And she was running regular services between Berlin and Friedrichshafen, right in the south of Germany. That was a distance of 370 miles, which she could do in 4 hours on a good day. Going by train took 18 to 20 hours. But ambitions in Britain ran far beyond competing with trains. The dream at government level was that in the early 20s was that Britain's worldwide empire would one day be linked by rapid airship transport. Think about it. When it took anything up to 6 weeks to get from Britain to Australia and New Zealand by sea, the idea of flying, travelling faster than by ship and by more direct routes, was irresistibly attractive. Are the airliners being turned out by the likes of de Havilland, Armstrong, Whitworth, Vickers, and Handley Page were faster than airships, but not a lot faster. And crucially, they had only short range, 500 miles at most, although that was probably plenty for the passengers because they were not for the faint-hearted. They were uncomfortable, noisy, cold, and far from reliable. So any rational person comparing airships and aeroplanes in the early 20s would have concluded that airships were the obvious way forward for long-distance air travel. Don't just take my word for it. This is Neville Shute. Neville Shute Norway, to give him his full name. He was better known in later years as a best-selling novelist. But in the 1920s, he was an engineer employed on airship design by the Vickers Company. Years later, he wrote, "It was generally agreed that the aeroplane would never be a very suitable vehicle for carrying passengers across the oceans, and that airships would operate all the long-distance routes of the future." We were all quite wrong, of course. But at that time, it seemed reasonable. No aeroplane had yet succeeded in crossing the Atlantic from east to west, while a German airship, or the Graf Zeppelin, was already carrying commercial loads of passengers both ways to South America on a regular schedule. I'll come back to the Graf Zeppelin later. In Britain, the political pressure behind airship development grew more intense after the general election of 1924. The incoming Labour government introduced the Imperial Airship Scheme. Under this scheme, 2 large airships would be built. The R100 would be built by Vickers at Howden, with the R101 by the state-owned Royal Airship Works at Cardington, near Bedford. The press soon nicknamed the R100 the capitalist ship, while the R101 became the socialist ship. The basic specification for the 2 airships was the same. They were to be able to carry 100 passengers in comfort over very long distances. That would require cabins, toilets, washing facilities, a dining room, kitchen, and public spaces. Now consider that for a moment, and you'll see how these 2 ships represented a huge leap in the dark for the British airship industry and its supporters. The R-36 had been built with space for 50 passengers, but it never actually carried that number, and it had never done regular airline type schedules like the Zeppelins were doing in Germany. It was an experimental prototype. And also, the R-36 had passenger accommodation in a long, narrow car underneath the hull, just like the contemporary Zeppelins. But that arrangement would not do for 100 passengers. The space required was far too large. So the passenger accommodation would have to be inside the hull, in the belly of the ship. You certainly couldn't fault the British for ambition and boundless optimism. Some said we were trying to run before we could walk, and subsequent events would prove them tragically right. The Germans appeared to proceed more cautiously, each new Zeppelin design being a logical step, using lessons learned from the previous one. They, of course, didn't have a worldwide empire to worry about. Their overseas colonies had been confiscated after the First World War. So where the British airships would be revolutionary, the Germans, the Zeppelins, were evolutionary. And in the mid 1920s, when design work was starting on the two British giants, the Zeppelin Company was building what would prove to be its most successful craft, the LZ 127 Graf Zeppelin. Graf means count in German, so the ship was named after the company's founder, who had died in 1917. Time now to introduce this gentleman, Dr. Hugo Eckener. He was a journalist in the first years of the 20th century, and he covered the early Zeppelin flights for his newspaper. He formed a close bond with Count Zeppelin, and eventually he joined the Zeppelin Company to do what is now called public relations. He quickly found that flying airships was a lot more fun than public relations. And by 1911, he was an airship captain. After the Great War, with Count Zeppelin dead, Eckener became the head of the company. His ambition was to fly passenger services across the Atlantic, a huge technical challenge, and Graf Zeppelin was his answer. It's a mark of the high esteem in which Eckener and the whole Zeppelin operation was held in Germany that the bulk of the 2 million marks construction work was paid for by public subscriptions. The Germans really loved their Zeppelins, rather as we came to love our Concorde, although we never had a whip round to pay for them. The Graf followed convention in putting the passenger accommodation under the hull, contiguous with the control car. There was accommodation for 24 passengers in 10 cabins and a dining and sitting room with 4 large windows connecting via a central corridor to the cabins, washrooms and toilets. It's testimony to the brilliance of the Graf's design and construction that she would stand years of battering by Atlantic storms and would fly right around the world with only 3 stops. There was a catwalk used only by the crew, which ran right through the centre of the ship from nose to tail. That's a distance of over 700 feet. It was said that in rough weather, 2 crewmen standing at the extreme ends of that catwalk would lose sight of each other as the ship flexed under the strain. I don't think the passengers were told that at the time. The Grass Round the World flight was in August 1929. It was promoted and partly financed by the American newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst. At his assistance, it started and ended at Lakehurst. The Graf flew across the Atlantic to Friedrichshafen, over Northern Europe and Asia to Japan, and then across the North Pacific to Los Angeles, and then back across America to Lakehurst. She covered over 20,000 miles with only those three refueling stops at an average speed of 68 miles an hour. Oh, that might sound like pretty stately progress now, but in 1929 it was a hugely impressive achievement, as well as becoming a celebrity in Germany. The Graf's captain, Hugo Echner, was presented to the US President Herbert Hoover, and he was awarded the Gold Medal of the National Geographic Society. In 1932, the Graf began providing regular scheduled passenger, mail, and freight services between Germany and Brazil. And she made a total of 64 round trips over 5 years. During her career, the Graf Zeppelin became the first aircraft in history to fly over 1,000,000 miles. She made 590 flights, 144 ocean crossings, carried over 13,000 passengers, and spent over 17,000 hours aloft. That's 717 days, or not far from 2 years. It was all accomplished without injury to a single passenger or crewman. Let's go back to the Empire airship scheme, which by the late 1920s was finally getting somewhere. Competition was high between the two design teams, but the basic principle was that both ships were prototypes. The most successful ideas from both would be rolled into their successors, the fleet of airships that would shrink the world, linking Britain to her empire. The intention was that after trial flights, the R100 would fly to Canada and the R101 to India. Now let's have a quick look at both. R100 first. This is Dr. Barnes Wallis, who later earned fame as the designer of the Vickers Wellington bomber of World War II and the bouncing bombs that destroyed the Ruhr dams in 1943. 20 years before that, Wallis was a senior designer at Vickers, and he became head of the R100 project. Neville Shute became chief calculator, responsible for the stress calculations on the ship's airframe. In the main brochures describing R100 issued at the time, it was said that the accommodation was intermediate in comfort between a Pullman coach and an ocean liner. It was described as like being inside a small hotel. So let's see for ourselves. R100 was a three-deck ship, as we see from this newspaper drawing from 1930. The passengers had the upper and middle decks, with the crew accommodation on the bottom deck. This picture shows the upper passenger deck with cabins set out around an open well overlooking the main lounge and dining room and the staircase going down. This is the lounge on the main deck, located in the center of the ship, and the lounge also doubled as the main dining area. In this picture, we see one of the promenade decks, which were again of double deck construction to make them light and airy. The upper gallery provided access to further passenger cabins and was also a place to enjoy the view through the huge side windows. The promenade decks were wide enough to function as lounges, providing comfortable seating when the central lounge was in use for dining. And here's a rather nice cutaway drawing of the R100's passenger accommodation. We can see the lounge dining room in the center, set out for dining. Cabins on 2 levels, oh, that's there, yeah. The starboard promenade deck with its huge windows, and crew accommodation on the bottom deck. The R100 was flown, she is tethered to the mooring mast at Howden. All right, and she was flown from Howden to uh, across the Atlantic to Montreal, arriving early on the 1st of August 1930 after a voyage of nearly 79 hours. The crew enjoyed banquets and receptions in their honour, and it seemed that this successful trip would be the first of many more crossings and the start of commercial operations. On her return to Cardington, R100 was put into the shed for inspection, and attention switched to R101's flight to India, which was expected to be before the end of the year. Unlike R101 or R100, R101 was a very innovative design with radical changes in structure, and she used diesel engines in order to minimize the risk of sparks causing a gas explosion. But they almost had a may-fly moment. To her designer's dismay, when she first flew, it was discovered that her useful lift was nowhere near what had been predicted. Drastic action would be required to increase hydrogen capacity. So R101 was brought into the hangar and was cut in half. That meant that an extra bay for another gas cell could be inserted to give the ship more lift. This brought her volume up to a huge 5.5 million cubic feet of hydrogen. R101 was now 777 feet long, 60 foot longer than R100, and by some way the largest airship yet built. Unlike the R100, R101 was a two-deck ship. The upper deck contained the main passenger accommodation, public spaces, lounge, dining room, and promenades. The lower deck contained the smoking room and washrooms and the crew accommodation. Incidentally, this is virtually the same layout that the Zeppelin company would adopt 2 years later for the Hindenburg. It's time for a quick look around. The intention was to create a lavish hotel atmosphere on board. This is the main lounge. Another shot of the lounge showing the entrance to the promenade deck. And unlike R100, R101 had a separate dining room, able to seat 50 people at one sitting. A dumb waiter hoisted the food up from the galley below to the dining room. And here's something unique on an airship at this time, a smoking room. One more. Yes, a smoking room able to accommodate 24 people. This is a two-berth passenger cabin, and the crew sleeping quarters were in the lower deck of the ship, and they were comfortable compared to the Zeppelins, where it was not uncommon for the crew to sleep in hammocks. And here's the galley. All the utensils were made of light aluminium. The galley was well fitted out with an all-electric oven and vegetable steamer and ample working space for the chef. A flying hotel indeed. And here she is flying. After being stretched at Cardington, R101 made her second first flight on the 26th of June 1930. 4 trial flights followed, and there should have been more, but here politics enters the tale. Lord Thompson, the Secretary of State for Air, and Sir Sefton Brancker, the Director of Civil Aviation, were the two most senior political backers of the Empire Airship Scheme. They were very keen for R101 to make her flight to India in early October, at which time the Imperial Conference was to be held in London. All those involved with R101 knew there was a lot wrong with her. For safety, she'd been powered by diesel engines, but they weighed over 2 tons each, and there were 5 of them. There were serious concerns about her ability to lift her payload in all weathers, and other technical concerns as well. A certificate of airworthiness, which was a legal requirement for her to fly abroad, was actually handed to her captain on the morning of the flight to India. And, of course, she never made it. With Lord Thompson, Sir Sefton Branca, her designer, Colonel Richmond, and 51 other people on board, she crashed into a hillside near Beauvais in northern France in dreadful weather, just 7.5 hours after leaving Cardington. Of the 54 people on board, 48 died and only 6, all members of the crew, survived. The inquiry concluded that the airship's outer cover had torn near the nose, allowing the airflow to damage the hydrogen cells inside. The loss of lift made the airship descend in a nose-down attitude until she struck the ground, probably doing no more than 13 miles an hour. As she slid along the rising ground, some of the mechanics in the engine cars managed to get out and run to safety. But once the hydrogen caught light, no one still on board stood a chance. When the 48 victims of the R101 disaster were laid to rest in a communal grave at Cardington, the British airship project was buried with them. R101's competitor, R100, despite a more successful development program and a satisfactory transatlantic trip to her credit, was grounded immediately. In 1931, the Imperial airship scheme was abandoned and R100 was broken up for scrap. Dr. Hugo Eckner, head of the Zeppelin Company, had inspected R101 at Cardington and had been impressed. When the Zeppelin Company started planning their new ship LZ-128, she was to have been virtually the same size as R101 with a similar amount of hydrogen. But the fiery crash of R101 convinced Eckner to build a ship that was capable of being lifted by helium, which would not burn in the event of a crash. Plans for the 5.3 million cubic feet LZ-128 were abandoned in favour of a design for a much larger ship, the 7 million cubic feet LZ-129. Design work on LZ-129 started at Friedrichshafen in late 1931. And here I think we must touch upon the political situation in Germany. It was a time of momentous change. The economy was in chaos, with even the biggest banks in danger of collapse. Amid the turmoil, the National Socialist Workers' Party, which we would all come to know as the Nazi Party, was making rapid progress in elections under its charismatic leader, Adolf Hitler. There was to be a presidential election in 1932, and it was expected that the sitting president, Paul von Hindenburg, would retire. Hindenburg was no Nazi, and neither was Hugo Eckner. He was admired throughout Germany and around the world for his leadership of the Zeppelin Company and his captaincy of the Krafft Zeppelin. As a presidential candidate, he stood out, and he was willing to stand until Hindenburg decided to stand again. Now, Hugo Eckner admired Hindenburg too much to stand against him. He took no further part in the election, which Hindenburg won. And then, in January 1933, the National Socialist Workers' Party won the largest number of seats in the parliamentary election. And President Hindenburg, no doubt with a heavy heart, asked Adolf Hitler to form a coalition government. Within 2 months, the Nazis had opened their first concentration camp at Dachau, near Munich. Within a year, all Hitler's critics in his own party were fled or dead. And within 3 years, the Nazis had Their plans for depriving the Jews of their jobs, their businesses, and their basic rights as citizens were all in place. The road to glory or disaster for Germany now lay wide open. And here we can play what if for a moment. President Hindenburg was a sick man by 1933, and he would be dead within the year. Hitler then moved smartly to have the presidency abolished and himself appointed Führer and Reich Chancellor, head of state and head of government. Whether Hugo Eckener, still far-sighted and vigorous and very popular, would have been able to contain Hitler's ambitions if he had been president is one of those tantalizing questions to which we can never know the answer. But back in 1931, money was hard to come by, even for the Zeppelin company, and progress on LZ-129 was slow. But when the Nazis came to power, Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, saw the symbolic value of such a mighty airship as a showcase for German technology. He offered Hugo Eckener a grant of 2 million marks towards the completion of the ship. That grant prompted Hermann Goering, the air minister, who detested Goebbels, to offer a grant of 9 million marks. So it was Nazi money that got LZ-129 built, and the money came with strings attached. The Zeppelin company was split in two parts, and Hugo Eckener, known to dislike the Nazis, was sidelined, becoming largely a figurehead. By the time LZ-129, now called Hindenburg after the late president, was complete, in March 1936, it was clear that helium would not be available. The only source of natural helium in those days was the United States. But as the 1930s progressed, the Americans became more and more convinced that Hitler had ambitions that would lead to war in Europe. They feared that if he had access to helium, he would use it in military airships. And so the US government forbade the supply of helium to the Zeppelin company. So much against Eckener's wishes, Hindenburg would have to be lifted by hydrogen after all. That meant, hydrogen being a lighter gas than helium, that she had far more useful lift than she needed for a complement of 50 passengers. After her first season of transatlantic flights in 1936, she had a refit during the winter, and she emerged with 10 more cabins, bringing her passenger capacity to 72. But what of that first season? Was it a success? Very much so. Bear in mind that Graf Zeppelin and earlier airships had provided their passengers with accommodation in a long, narrow car under the hull, reminiscent, if you like, of a train. I now consider that Hindenburg offered passengers spacious accommodation within her vast hull, comparable, in fact, with a ship. She was, in effect, the R101 built properly, and not hamstrung by over-ambitious design parameters or politically inspired timetables. Hindenburg was a step change in air travel, and people were very impressed indeed. At last it was possible to travel between Europe and the USA without spending a week or more on the notoriously rough North Atlantic. The airship's hour had finally come. So let's have a look around. Here we see again people disembarking at Lakehurst. Unlike the British airships, where passengers entered at the nose of the ship, Hindenburg has two retractable staircases that go down to the ground, nicknamed the Himmelstreppe, or Stairways to Heaven. They lead up to the ship's lower deck, B deck, and from here a double staircase rises to A deck, where the main passenger accommodation is located. On A deck in the centre are 25 identical twin cabins, as shown in this photo. The top bunk folds against the wall if only one person is occupying the cabin. There's a wash basin and a small clothes closet and a button to summon the steward. Shoes can be left outside for cleaning overnight, just like in any good hotel. Step out of your cabin and go to the port side of the ship, and you enter the dining room. It's 47 feet by 13, and there are 2 and 4 place tables to seat 50 passengers at one sitting. On the walls are paintings on silk wallpaper of Graf Zeppelin's round flights to South America. And alongside the dining room is the promenade deck with bench seats and huge windows, as you can see in this picture. You can spend hours sitting on the promenade if you like, watching the countryside or the ocean drifting by 1,000 or 2,000 feet below you. Or you can stroll out of the dining room and cross to the starboard side of the ship, where you'll find the lounge and reading room. The lounge is 34 feet by 13, and the big map on the wall depicts great exploration voyages of the past, and also Graf Zeppelin's round-the-world flight. There's even a piano, a baby grand made of aluminium and covered in pigskin. Unlike the dining room, the lounge has a promenade beside it with panoramic windows and bench seating. Promenade also gives access to the reading room, a quiet refuge in case things get a bit lively in the lounge. Here we have a cutaway drawing and a plan of A deck. Here are 25 identical cabins in the centre. Here's the dining room and portside promenade, and the lounge and reading room and starboard promenade. And here's the staircase going down to B deck. Now, fancy a drink? Well, a steward will bring you one, of course, but it might be more fun to head downstairs to the bar and smoking room. The bar, with its Spanish-themed painting on the wall, is entered via 2 doors which act as an airlock. The bar and the smoking room beyond are kept at slightly higher pressure, so that if there is any stray hydrogen in the in the air outside, it can't enter. As well as mixing cocktails, the barman keeps an eye on passengers leaving to make sure nobody is going out with a lit cigar, cigarette, or pipe. And here's the smoking room. Always a popular place in an era when most men and an increasing number of women smoke. In this room is the only cigarette lighter that's allowed on the ship. It's an electric one, similar to a car cigarette lighter, but wired into a socket. So how was life for a Hindenburg passenger? Pretty lively sometimes. Journalist Webb Miller gave this account of the hijinks on Hindenburg's maiden flight to the USA in May 1936. That night, stewards served a 5-course gala dinner, including fresh trout from the Black Forest. Many of the passengers wore evening clothes for the occasion. After dinner, we made a broadcast to the United States, including a piano recital by Professor Wagner, songs by Lady Wilkins, and speeches by Dr. Eckner and several of the passengers, including myself. After the broadcast, passengers gathered in the smoking room and bar to celebrate with many toasts and songs our approach to the American continent. Pauline Charteris introduced a song that she picked up in Nassau, which ran, "Mama don't want no gin because it makes her sin." And we discussed a suitable name for the first child conceived in midair aboard a Zeppelin, a distinct possibility nowadays. I suggested helium if it were a boy, and helium if it were a girl, and that idea was adopted. And the hilarious party continued most of the night. If you've been in any modern airliners, you can make your own comparison. I bet there was no piano. Here we see Lady Wilkins and Professor Wagner belting it out. And here is Pauline Charteris with her husband Leslie, the author of the Simon Templar Saint novels. And here are some more shots of life in the Hindenburg's lounge with the old Joanna in the background. Quite often there were celebrities abroad. There's no doubt that Hindenburg was the glamorous way to cross the Atlantic in 1936. A flight in August had the former heavyweight boxing champion Max Schmeling on board. He was on his way to fight Joe Louis for a chance to meet Jim Braddock, the current world champ. When Schmeling beat Louis, the first man ever to do so, he returned on Hindenburg a national hero. The Hollywood star Douglas Fairbanks Sr. was another traveller on Hindenburg with his new wife, Sylvia. She was an English girl, a former lingerie model and showgirl, who had also already been married to the English peer Lord Ashley. After Fairbanks, she'd go on to marry a second English peer, a Russian racing driver, and the film star Gary Cooper. That's quite a life. On Hindenburg, the Fairbanks had a 6-month-old Scotty dog called Bobby with them, which apparently had the run of the ship and used to cock his leg up on the furniture, much to the irritation of the stewards who had to clean it up. I don't think that happens much on modern airliners either. But now, just before Hindenburg arrives at Lakehurst, you might like to hear how such a huge airship is actually flown. A Zeppelin is commanded like a ship rather than being piloted like a plane. The captain's in overall control, but watch officers make all necessary decisions and issue orders to the crew. Like ocean liners, airships need a substantial crew with a wide range of skills to operate them. Hindenburg has a regular crew of 40 who work mostly in 4-hour shifts. Hindenburg's heading is controlled by a helmsman via a large wheel connected to the rudders, very much as on a ship. The helm wheel is shown in the centre of this picture. But note the second wheel on the left. That is the elevator wheel. And it's the elevator man's duty to keep the ship level, largely for the comfort and safety of all on board. Most importantly, the passengers and the chefs in the kitchen. There are gauges to help him, but standing sideways to the direction of the ship's direction of control, direction of travel, an experienced elevator man can sense the movement of the ship through his feet, and he will be spinning the wheel this way and that to keep her level. It can be hard work. In an unheated control car on a rough day, the elevator man is the one who's sweating. Well, let's stay in the control car because it's now 7:20 in the evening of Thursday, the 6th of May, 1937, and Hindenburg's long journey across the Atlantic is over at last. The weather at Lakehurst has been fickle all day, with sunshine, wind, and heavy showers, and now there's a thunderstorm prowling in the distance. We're making an into-wind approach from the west, but the wind direction changes abruptly as another squall arrives, gusting to 25 knots. We have to maneuver quickly to bring the ship into wind. But as we make a sharp S turn onto a southwesterly heading, Hindenburg's tail is settling. The captain orders water ballast to be dropped from the tail. Where that doesn't help, more water is dropped, and then more still. Finally, several crewmen are ordered forward to the ship's nose to add their weight. We need to land quickly. But among the hundreds of people watching on the ground are several from what we now call the media. One of them is the cameraman shooting this newsreel. But there's also a young reporter from a Chicago radio station, Herb Morrison. He isn't doing a live broadcast, but making a recording for use later. So it is that, quite by chance, we have not only the silent newsreel footage you're watching, but also Herb Morrison's words describing in vivid detail what's unfolding before his eyes. Well, here it comes, ladies and gentlemen. And what a sight it is, a thrilling one, a marvellous sight. It's practically standing still now. They've dropped ropes out of the nose of the ship, and they've been taken a hold of down on the field by a number of men. It's starting to rain again. The rain had slacked off a little. The back motors of the ship are holding it, just holding. Oh, it's burst into flames. It's burst into flames. It's falling. It's crashing. It's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. It's smoke and it's flames and the flames crashing to the ground. Oh, the humanity. And all the passengers screaming around here. I can't even talk to people whose friends are on there. Honest, it's just lying there, a mass of smoking wreckage. And everybody can hardly breathe or talk, and there's screaming. Honest, I can hardly breathe. I've got to step inside where I can't see it. Listen, folks, I've got to have to stop for a minute because I'm losing my voice. This is the worst thing I've ever witnessed. Out of the flames, out of the billowing, stinking smoke, out of the searing heat, out of the chaos and the terror come the lucky ones. The ground crew to run to help them and lead them or carry them to safety. They're dazed, bewildered, panic-stricken, distraught, hardly able to grasp that the great placid machine that's carried them safely across the wide Atlantic has so suddenly and viciously turned on them. From first flame to total ruin takes 34 seconds. Of the 97 people on board, 35 die, and quite astonishingly, 62 survive. One member of the ground crew also dies as the doomed airship comes down on him. In the weeks and months that followed, many theories were advanced about the cause of the Hindenburg disaster. There was no evidence to prove any one theory conclusively. Many thought that she'd been deliberately destroyed, but there was no credible evidence to support that idea. All that could be agreed is that one or more gas cells near the airship's tail had been damaged in flight, allowing hydrogen to escape, and that it was then set alight, either by an electric spark inside the hull or by an electric discharge in the atmosphere outside. Anything beyond that was conjecture and a problem that couldn't be explained, couldn't be solved. There had been many worse tragedies in the past. There have been many more since, and we've all become accustomed to seeing them on our televisions. But never before that day, the 6th of May 1937, had a disaster unfolded on film and been described in heart-stopping detail by a witness as it happened. Try to imagine the effect in those pre-TV days when the silent newsreel footage was put together with Herb Morrison's agonized commentary and shown in cinemas around the world. No one, and certainly no fare-paying passenger, would ever put their trust in hydrogen-lift airships again. The Graf Zeppelin, on her way back from Brazil, was over the Canary Islands when the awful news about Hindenburg reached her. The captain decided not to tell the passengers until she landed in Germany. And then she was grounded, and she would later be scrapped. Her half-built replacement, the Hindenburg-like LZ-130, was broken up. No passenger-carrying airship ever flew again. Like Concorde and like the dinosaurs, Zeppelins are extinct. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. Thank you.